Greetings. I am Dr. Graciela Caneiro Livingston, Provost at Nebraska Wesleyan University. I want to welcome you to this year's presentation of Spooky Evenings. We here at Nebraska Wesleyan are excited and proud of this event that brings together scholars, artists, authors, and filmmakers to discuss the topic of horror in its various manifestations across the arts and the humanities. Professor Juan Jose Castaño Marquez and Dr. Matthew Jarvis have been working tirelessly to bring you the best scholarship in the field of horror through this unparalleled digital humanities event. I would like to acknowledge the generous support from the Nebraska Arts Council, Humanities Nebraska, and the Nebraska Cultural Endowment that helps make quality programming like Spooky Evenings possible. Again, welcome and enjoy this presentation of Spooky Evenings.
Tonight on Spooky Evenings, Dr. Karen Renner of Northern Arizona University presents a talk entitled Everything You Never Wanted to Know About Children of the Corn. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Dr. Karen J. Renner. Third time appearance.
Second.
No, you were on our Halloween dissection on November 1st.
Oh, true.
See, third time appearance. I keep score. Karen is also one of my go-to people for all things spooky. And we've had several chats, extracurricular spooky chats, particularly over the summer. I asked Karen to take on this topic because of her specialization in creepy, weird, demonic, possessed, disturbed, deranged, other adjectives, children. So tonight she's going to present to us everything you never wanted to know about Children of the Corn. And I understand you watched the entire series to set the mood.
I did indeed.
I feel like that's like an achievement you unlock in an app or something.
Some sort of like sadistic, masochistic, I don't know, achievement maybe, yeah.
I watched the first two yesterday. In preparation for you coming on, but that's about the most I could commit myself to. I don't think I've seen them all. I've seen most of them, but
well, you're going to learn a lot about them.
How many are there?
There are, well, depending on how you count, there would be 12 if you count the short film.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, 13 with the missing film.
Well, no, 12 counting that one, I guess.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Got it. Well, then, without further ado, please tell us everything we never wanted to know about Children of the Corn.
All right. Thank you. Let's see here. All right. Well, hello, Nebraska. So I don't think I've ever given a presentation during which I was more aware of who my audience was. As a horror scholar, it feels like a real honor to be presenting on Children of the Corn to people actually living in its home state. So thanks so much for having me back. I've taken this job really seriously. As I said, I've watched every movie in the franchise, and that's no small or painless feat. And what I'm going to do is quickly escort you through the franchise and then end by discussing some of the prominent trends that I've noticed and kind of speculate about what they suggest about our cultural climate and the climate of the world of horror. So obviously it goes without saying that there are going to be lots of spoilers. So it was during a long drive to Colorado that Stephen King got the idea for the story. He said in an interview that he was especially taken with the Nebraskan landscape. I also really like Nebraska, he said. It's made a tremendous impression on me. All those wide open spaces and that big, big sky. Very strange, very Lovecraftian. First published in Penthouse in March 1977, and then again as part of King's first collection of stories, Night Shift, in 1978. Children of the Corn saw its first adaptation, a short film titled Disciples of the Crow, in 1983, and its first feature-length film the next year. And since then, the 29-page short story has spawned 10 additional films, 5 in the 1990s, 2 in the 2000s, 2 in the 2010s, and its latest installment came last year. So what this means then is that Children of the Corn has just entered its 6th decade of existence, if you can believe it. So at first glance, that might not seem like that big a deal, considering that horror is really known for its franchises. The 9 films in the Saw series, for example, have generated over $1 billion worldwide, and that's just over the last 20 years. And though a little behind on its original schedule, there are currently 13 films planned for the Halloween franchise, which, like Children of the Corn, has also spanned 6 decades. And the Friday the 13th franchise has almost as many movies and shares a crossover film with Nightmare on Elm Street, which itself is a robust franchise of 9 films. But Children of the Corn holds a distinctive place in the American imagination because it's the only horror franchise to focus on evil children. A subject which is of particular interest to me. So I've edited 1 book on the subject, written another, and I'm currently working on a 3rd entitled Killer Kids, Youth Violence in U.S. Popular Culture. But even if you've never read Children of the Corn nor seen a single one of the 12 films it's inspired, you probably know what the story is generally about. So a cult of children in rural Nebraska kill all of the adults in town in honor of some sort of supernatural creature that lives in the cornfields, and they call him He Who Walks Behind the Rows. So King's story focuses on Bert and his wife, Vicky, who have embarked on a road trip in hopes of improving their ailing marriage, though it's unclear how a road trip would ever do that. It doesn't work. And in fact, their arguments only escalate after Bert leaves the interstate and the couple finds himself lost in rural Nebraska. During one of their fights, Bert hits a child who stumbles out into the road. However, in examining the body, Bert, who's a Vietnam vet in the short story, realizes that the child's throat had been fatally cut before Bert hit him. They put the child's body in the trunk and head to the nearest town, which unfortunately for them happens to be Gatlin. While there, they discover the town's dark history and become its latest victims. Toward the end of the story, the reader discovers that what looks to be the crazed beliefs of America's latest cult actually has some grounding in reality, for He Who Walks Behind the Rows is revealed to be an actual entity. The story ends in the perspective of Ruth, who is pregnant with the child of a boy named Malachi, and who has to watch him walk into the fields, the latest sacrifice to the corn god. So Ruth is the only conscientious objector in the cult. We're told that she, quote, had conceived a secret hatred for the corn and sometimes dreamed of walking into it with a torch in each hand when dry September came and the stalks were dead and explosively combustible. So Ruth will come up again as a character in the franchise. The first film adaptation, released in 1984, remains relatively faithful to the story, at least at first. Bert and Vicky, Vicky's played by Linda Hamilton, who had starred in Terminator just that year. They're not married and they fight far less. Bert isn't a Vietnam vet, he's a medical doctor, and the couple are driving to his first job in Seattle. And they're also driving around with a copy of Night Shift on their dash, but apparently they haven't read it because, like their short story counterparts, they just stroll right on into Gatlin. The film also invents two children, Job and Sarah, who provide the dissenting mindset that Ruth gave to the story and who help Bert and Vicky not only survive their ordeal, but also destroy the cornfield and its god. And I couldn't resist mentioning this really weird fact. The actor who played Sarah is now an associate professor at UC Irvine, and she studies, of all things, adolescent development, which I just think is amazing. So the film opts for an almost comically happy ending, with Bert and Vicky essentially deciding to adopt Job and Sarah. One of the members of the cult, Rachel, hides in their car hoping to take revenge, but she is easily dispatched by a door to the head. Rachel, too, as we'll see, will appear again as a character in a later film. Though it obviously differs greatly in terms of tone, the film did contribute key tropes to the franchise. The character of Isaac, the leader of the cult, for example, was greatly expanded upon. Played by a then 24-year-old John Franklin, who suffered from a growth hormone deficiency as a child, so he could play a child. Isaac is especially memorable for his iconic wide-brimmed black hat, his gift for sermonizing, and his famous last line. So after he's attacked by a very disappointed he who walks behind the rose, he returns to say, "He wants you too, Malachi." Now, if you grew up with this movie, it's likely that at some point you said this to a sibling or friend, and I was particularly fond of quoting it to my brother anytime he thought he had evaded punishment for some bad thing we had done together. The scene is frequently featured in GIFs and memes, though often with Malachi's name unfortunately misspelled so that it resembles a warm and spicy tea beverage. The character of Malachi, played by Courtney Gaines, was given more development as well, and also earned a place in the cultural memory, perhaps most famously for the scene in which he tries to lure Bert out of hiding by threatening to kill Vicky. "Outlander," he yells, "we have your woman. Outlander, her blood will spill unless you give yourself up." And this scene, as you can see, was spoofed in South Park as well as in other places. But perhaps what the Children of the Corn franchise became most known for after were its rather terrible effects, such as in the top video when Isaac is attacked by he who walks behind the rose, or in the bottom video, which represents the creature's death after Bert and the gang blow up the cornfield. So if you watch that bottom image carefully, you should be able to see what looks like, I think it's a giant face in that mushroom cloud. I don't know what it's supposed to be, but it's bad. So though it would be 8 years before the franchise would see its next installment, the sequel, The Final Sacrifice, picks up right where the first left off. The mass murders in Gatlin have been discovered, and residents of the neighboring town of Hemmingford Home, which you might recognize as Mother Abigail's home in The Stand, have adopted the children left behind. He who walks behind the rose returns to possess one of them, Micah, in a scene that displays 1990 CGI in all of its terrible glory. Micah becomes the new leader of the cult, and although he forgoes Isaac's iconic hat, he more than makes up for it with his fearsome and disapproving glares. The protagonists of this film are Father John Barrett and his son Danny, who, like Vicky and Bert, are going through a rough patch in their relationship. John has just divorced Danny's mother and is heading to Hemmingford Home in order to cover the story for the disreputable tabloid he's working for, hoping that in doing so, he can reverse the downward spiral of his journalism career. Along the way, both find love, Danny with the orphaned girl Lacey, and John with Angela, the owner of a local bed and breakfast who wears shoulder pads even in her t-shirts, and who has, unfortunately for the Barretts, just adopted Micah. The film features a whole series of absurd and hilarious Final Destination-esque death scenes, including impalement by cornstalk and the murder of a poor woman whose electric chair is taken over by Micah and steered into traffic, where she is hit by a truck and launched through the window of a storefront. What The Final Sacrifice did for the franchise, though, was to attempt, and I'm using that word pretty purposefully, attempt to account for the children's violence by pointing to causes commonly cited in the media of the time. For example, at one point, John meets a Native American cliche named Dr. Frank Redbear, who is an anthropologist at the local university. Together, they discover that the town has been supplementing their poor harvest by mixing in with it a batch of poisoned corn from the year before. The local adults are all in on the scam, and when John and Redbear try to expose it, the local sheriff ties them up and tries to run them over with a harvester. So one explanation for the children's violence is that they have learned it from watching their parental figures who are all willing to kill others just for a buck. But this isn't the only symbolic cause the film provides. Parental failures are another. Danny becomes momentarily vulnerable to the temptations of the cult simply because his parents have failed to provide him a satisfying home life. John became a father at 17, which he admits was far too young and the reason for his divorce. In a bid to win Danny over, Micah also reveals that his own father had been unfaithful. And if these aren't explanation enough, at one point, Red Bear shows John some local petroglyphs and reveals that the children's violence was all foretold in Native American myth, which predicted that children would rise up against their elders in retribution for the mistreatment of the earth. So we also get somewhat of a environmental critique as well going on in this film. After some near-death experiences, the white middle-class foursome of John, Danny, Angela, and Lacey emerge triumphant and drive off into the proverbial sunset. And although Red Bear does die in the process in a disturbingly insensitive moment of irony, so he's killed by bow and arrow, he is able to find a place in the afterlife that allows him to become a fully fledged Native American cliche and serve as the town's spirit guide and protector. And so in the bottom right-hand corner, you can see his spirit disappearing into the landscape there. Released the next year straight to video, as all of the subsequent sequels would be until the most recent one, Urban Harvest moved the story from Nebraska to Chicago, as former Gatlin residents Eli and his older brother Joshua are adopted by a kindly couple in the Windy City. In a turn of incredible coincidence, their adoptive father trades in commodities and also lives next door to an abandoned factory. This allows Eli to put his evil master plan into place, which is growing a batch of corn that turns the children who eat it into mindless drones of the cult. And then he's going to have his father use his business connections to ship it all over the world. And the plan is ultimately successful. The final shot of the film shows a crate filled with the corn labeled in German. And I can't help thinking this is some sort of reference to Raiders of the Lost Ark, but maybe I'm reaching there. But clearly there's a capitalistic critique going on as well. Entwined with this ham-fisted capitalistic critique is an equally ham-fisted environmental one. At one point in the film, Eli co-opts Sunday church service in order to proselytize to the young in his community who he hopes to recruit. He says, Joseph loved the land who provided food for our bellies, timber for our shelters, oceans to play in, and air to sustain. But he foresaw that fools would desecrate our mother earth, poison our food with pesticides, cut down our forests like grass, choke the air with pollution, and cloud our water with sewage. And there's also a supernatural origin story to Eli's evil. Over the course of the movie, we discover that Eli was actually alive during the original slaughter of the adults in Gatlin, and that he hasn't aged since. During a confrontation with the local priest, the priest asks, "Who are you?" And Eli responds, "Father," as if you didn't know, suggesting that he who walks behind the rose is just another euphemism for the devil. Eli's supernatural powers are linked to a magical Bible, and its destruction proves to be his undoing. But even though that's a happy ending, I would argue that with the corn being shipped out to the world, it's still a sad ending. And there are some major shenanigans that take place, caused by the sudden appearance of some sort of monstrous creature who rises from Eli's cornfield. So created via practical effects and not CGI, these final scenes are equally amusing. So one of my favorite moments that you've been watching is when one girl is snatched up by the creature and the camera cuts to what is obviously a Barbie doll. And during these final scenes, we also witness the unfortunate death of Charlize Theron, who made her cinematic debut in this film. So what it might be an homage to the Evil Dead, she appears to be raped and killed by a cornstalk, as far as I can tell, or a tentacle of the creature. The star of Part 4, The Gathering, is also a familiar face. Released just a year later in 1996, it stars Naomi Watts taking on evil kids before she would do so again in The Ring. Her character, Grace, is returning to her hometown of Grand Island, Nebraska, in order to care for her agoraphobic mother and siblings, James and Margaret. The film hints at symbolic reasons for the antics about to ensue right away. As Grace drives through Grand Island, the epitome of small town America, a radio program announces that the Norman Rockwell age is over and describes a report that cites the sale of small farms, the deterioration of family life, and the allure of the urban economy as the primary causes. The townspeople in this film are not the perpetrators of capitalistic crimes, as in part 2, but the victims of a changing economy. The film also adopts a supernatural explanation, but in this case, it is linked to the adult abuse of children. So the villain in this story, Josiah, and like Isaac, Micah, and Eli before him, he's a child preacher who also shows a penchant for the broad-brimmed hat. However, unlike his predecessors, he's a vengeful ghost rather than a flesh and blood boy. We learn that he was born of sin to a young girl who abandoned him and that he was taken in by traveling preachers. He proved to be very successful and earned the preachers a lot of money. Worried that the profits would dry up if Josiah aged, the preachers tried to keep him young by depriving him of sleep and poisoning him with mercury for some reason, but it only made the boy crazy. So finally, they made a deal with the devil, and that worked, but the town discovered the sources of his youth, and so they stopped going to his revivals, and the adult preachers, having no use for him, abandoned him just as his mother had. So in retribution, Josiah killed them all with a scythe, and the townspeople in turn dragged him out to the cornfield and burned him alive. So the film sprinkles in a critique of bad parenting. So just as we discover that Margaret is actually Grace's daughter and not her sister, and that she left her behind with her mother in order to pursue medical school, we also find out that an elderly resident in the town is the mother of Josiah, and that she's the one who abandoned him. Along the way, we also learn about a couple of boys from the same era who were killed by their father and whose spirits come to possess a pair of local twins. But never fear, by the end of the movie, we again see the restoration of the nuclear family just as we had in parts 1 and 2. Fields of Terror, released in 1998, would dispense with the nuclear family altogether and focus instead on young adults, 5 college students who are driving somewhere to sprinkle the ashes of a dead friend. So unbeknownst to them, a boy named Ezekiel has been possessed by he who walks behind the rows. But lucky for Ezekiel, there was a ready-made cult waiting for him, led by a man named Luke, who is played by none other than David Carradine. So Luke claims that a green fire appeared in the fields and that this green fire summoned children who had been abused and neglected. And this gets the attention of our protagonist, Allison. She reveals that she had an abusive father and moved out as soon as she could, leaving behind her younger brother, Jacob, to take the brunt of it. Jacob ran away from home at 14 and said that he was going to devote himself to he who walks behind the rows. Allison arranges a meeting with her brother to apologize and reunite. He initially appears to reject her, saying that he has a pregnant wife and is happy where he is, but Allison realizes that he is actually sending her a secret cry for help, that he's trapped with this cult against his will. The movie has its fair share of terrible effects that by now viewers had come to expect. I particularly enjoy the scene in which the character, the top video, in which the character Kier, who is played by Eva Mendes, sacrifices herself to the green fire thingy. But my absolute favorite is when Carradine's head splits apart, yielding some sort of fire-breathing creature that then blows a hole in the head of the town sheriff. And I really love especially how unreactive the protagonist is. The boy even looks a little bit upset. She just looks like she's not impressed at all. Allison is unable to save her brother, but she tries to make up for it. So after destroying the corn god, she takes the hands of the children left behind. She also adopts her brother's child. In a final shot, however, the baby's eyes turn yellow, suggesting that the child is the new incarnation of he who walks behind the rows. In short, then, Fields of Terror marks a shift away from the capitalistic and environmental critiques promoted by previous films and toward more of a supernatural framework. And in addition, it marks a shift away from adult and parent protagonists to single young adults. The last installment of the 1990s Children of the Corn 666 Isaac's Return plays upon an interesting premise, namely that enough time has passed that the original Children of the Corn now have grown-up children of their own. In other words, we are now dealing with the Children of the Corn, as one character quips. One of those grandchildren of the Corn, Hannah Martin, has returned to the area to discover the identity of her mother, who was one of the original members of the cult. Hannah's mother is eventually revealed to be Rachel. And you might remember Rachel is the character from the first film who Linda Hamilton dispatched with a car door. And Rachel is played by Nancy Allen, which is pretty interesting considering you might recognize her from another Stephen King film, Carrie. She's the big jerk that came up with the plan of dumping the pig's blood all over the title character. More importantly, Isaac is back, and so is his hat. Yay! John Franklin reprised his role as Isaac and also co-wrote the film. The claim is that Isaac actually survived his encounter with He Who Walks Behind the Rose and has been in a coma for the past 19 years. Isaac has a dream. Isaac wants to meet the firstborn Gatlin boy, who happens to be his son, Matt, with the firstborn Gatlin girl, who happens to be Hannah, in order to create a superior race of corn children of some kind. But Hannah's not having it because she's way more into this fox, Gabriel, and the movie makes sure that we approve of her choice by making him extra dreamy and cute. But in a shocking plot twist that everyone sees coming, it turns out that Gabriel is actually He Who Walks Behind the Rose, and he has been inhabiting the body of the true firstborn male, whom Isaac secretly disposed of in order to favor his own son. But by the time Hannah learns all of this, it's too late. She's already had sex with Gabriel, and as he tells her before dying, the seeds have already been sown. The primary purpose of this installment, it seems, was to showcase John Franklin, but there are hints of a pro-choice narrative in the story too. In the beginning, Hannah picks up a ghostly preacher who is stranded on the side of the road, and they have a strange exchange before he vanishes into thin air. He says, if you have a son, you should name him Samuel. She says, I don't see kids in my future. Unfortunately, that's not for you to decide. And she says, fortunately, I have a choice. And he says, do you? And as we see by the end of the film, Hannah's pregnant with evil incarnate. And the film seems to suggest that perhaps sometimes abortion might be best for everyone involved. But she doesn't have any ability to follow that. None of this really matters, though, because Children of the Corn Revelation, released just 2 years later in 2001, ignored most of this plot. So Revelation takes place in Omaha, specifically in an apartment building named the Hampton Arms. Our protagonist, Jamie, comes to the building looking for her grandmother, who appears to have disappeared. Jamie's especially close to her grandmother because both of her parents were killed in a fire. Jamie discovers a lot of weird goings on in the Hampton Arms, not the least of which are a bunch of moody looking kids who stare at her a lot and then sometimes kill people. Thankfully for Jamie, a priest played by Michael Ironside comes to her aid. With the assistance of some cool special effects, he explains that her grandmother was part of a child cult led by a boy named Abel. On Abel's command, the kids were to commit suicide by setting their revival tent on fire while they were inside, and that's what you're seeing in the top right. But Jamie's grandmother escaped. The Hampton Arms is built on the site of the tragedy. And Abel believes that Jamie's grandmother should have died in the fire and that neither Jamie nor her parents should have been born. So he's taken care of the first two generations, and now he's set his sights on Jamie. Jamie then finds out that there's corn growing in the basement, fed by the body of her dead grandmother and other residents, but she's having none of it. She sets the whole place on fire, killing Abel and destroying the corn in the process. She almost dies, but is rescued at the last minute by her love interest. So similar to the immediate predecessor, this film foregoes causal explanations like bad parenting, capitalistic abuses, environmental destruction in favor of a psychologically driven narrative that relies really on the idea of destiny or fate. So after 6 movies and 10 years, the franchise took a little nap, which was ended by the appearance of a 2009 remake. In ways, the film was much more loyal to the original short story. Bert and Vicky do spend a good part of the film fighting with each other, and Bert's history as a Vietnam veteran takes on more importance. And similar to the short story, Vicky and Bert are dead by the end of the film. At the same time, the remake clearly wanted to appeal to fans of the first film, and so gave prominent parts to the characters of Malachi and Isaac and incorporated an even bigger hat. Children of the Corn Genesis, released the next year, focuses on a pregnant couple named Allie and Tim, who become stranded when their car breaks down. Unfortunately for them, they seek help at a nearby house where they meet a man called the Preacher and his much younger and more attractive Ukrainian mail order bride, Oksana, who sometimes goes by Helen. They stay the night, hoping to catch a ride back to civilization with a delivery man scheduled to come the next morning. During the night, however, Allie discovers that there's a little boy locked up in a shed, and she becomes intent on saving him, only to find out that the kid is the new incarnation of evil and that he's after Allie's unborn child. The Preacher explains that the supernatural force lives inside children, but children grow up, become adults, and adults become unwilling to kill. So then the force needs to seek out other children to do its bidding. The next morning, the two manage to escape. As they drive away, we see Oksana give the little boy a set of toy cars. As the child plays with the toys, Allie and Tim watch in horror as cars leap off the carrier in front of them, causing them to crash. Tim dies in the accident, and Allie is returned to the home of the Preacher, where she is greeted by other children and mothers, presumably also carrying future children of the corn, and assumes her place as the child's caretaker. Like the other films of the new millennium, this one offers no explanations for evil children except supernatural ones, and also ends with a single woman burdened with being a caretaker. It was another 7 years before the next film was released in 2018. Runaway is the first in the series to focus on one of the original children of the corn. And again, we're getting the character of Ruth returning here. So Ruth, we learn, escaped from the cult and gave birth to her child, Aaron, who would also be Malachi's child, soon after. Ruth has remained on the run ever since, refusing to settle down in one place for too long. And this lifestyle has taken its toll on Aaron, who longs for some normalcy. And just as they seem to be starting to achieve some semblance of that, all hell breaks loose, literally. So first, it's clear that Ruth is deeply traumatized by the mass murder of the Gatlin adults that she witnessed and took part in. She frequently flashes back to scenes of violence. Meanwhile, all around her, people are dying, and they are suspiciously people who cross her in some way, including the principal at the local school who refuses to let Aaron enroll, and the mechanic who hires and houses them only to kick them out when Ruth rejects his advances. And a mysterious little girl in a yellow dress is seen as directly responsible for these murders. However, in a plot twist that is spoiled long before by some overly suggestive cinematography, the little girl is revealed to be Ruth's alter ego, the embodiment of her younger self. At the end of the film, Aaron kills his mother and assumes his place as the next child preacher. The latest entry in the Children of the Corn series, simply named Children of the Corn, received a very limited release in October 2020, and it still isn't available for viewing. So it's hard to figure out exactly what its connection is to the rest of the films. But what is known is that it has a female-led cast. It'll be the first film to center on a girl villain, and her nemesis is also a teen girl. The film has been called both a remake and a prequel, but descriptions make it sound more like the former because they talk about a psychopathic girl who leads other children in her small Nebraska town to slaughter adults, opposed only by one bright high schooler. In addition, it seems like the film might be returning to some of the tendencies of its 1990s predecessors by pointing to some sort of symbolic reason for the children's violence. As you can see in the top description, the adults are described as corrupt, while in the bottom, which is the description on IMDb, the bottom states that the adults' irresponsibility ruins the corn and the children's future. But until the film is released more widely, all we can really do is speculate. So we've made it through all the movies. So in the final moments, what I'd like to do is look at some trends. So some general trends. The primary villains have almost always been male, but more recently we've seen a shift to female villains. And this shift, I'm thinking, kind of fits into a trend in Hollywood generally. Things like Ocean's 8, Ghostbusters, the kind of gender flipping that we've seen recent remakes do, or reboots. And it also fits horror specifically. I'm thinking specifically of Pet Sematary, that did kind of flipping with the genders of children. And also there are rumors out there of an all-female Lord of the Rings remake, which I'm wondering about. The films primarily focus on couples or parents, but a surprising number do focus on single women, which suggests to me that these movies are a variation on the slasher film, and that the young women protagonists are kind of functioning as final girls. The original versions of the stories pitted older adults against kids, but the age gap between the protagonists and the child villains has really decreased over time. And happy endings used to coincide with the reformation of the nuclear family, or at least the promise of a nuclear family. Unhappy endings typically find women in the position of caring for, or maybe having to give birth to the next generation of evil. And so I'm thinking that the films are also functioning in part as perhaps rejections of single motherhood, demonization of single motherhood. Or, I mean, if we took a more progressive view, we could see them as also kind of embodying the hardships of single motherhood. And then the other trend I'm seeing is that while earlier films tended to incorporate other symbolic causes of evil children, so capitalism, environmental destruction, neglectful or abusive homes, later films have tended to employ the idea of fate, that the past has somehow destined a certain future that can't be escaped. And I can't help but think of this in reference to the ways that the current generation is often presented as being kind of plagued by the ills of the boomers. And I'm wondering if there's some sort of connection going on there. But that is all that I have for you. So I am ready to discuss.
Let's discuss
These many films.
Can we go to the side by side maybe for the discussion?
Yes. Should I just stop sharing?
Yes. There you go.
Okay.
Now I can actually see you, because you're
All
actually
right.
we're behind a light, so
Oh,
you were
gotcha.
extra disembodied for me. My final thought was the Calvinist Children of the Corn.
Yeah, tell me more.
Well, predestination, right? The idea.
Very interesting. The connections to the Puritans. I definitely see
Yeah.
that. But I guess the people who are cursed are the women a lot of times in these films,
That
right?
would fit too with the Puritans, I believe.
I guess so. I guess that is true. That is true.
Because they dress kind of, I mean, especially the original Isaac, right? Is
Mhm.
very Puritan via the Joad family.
Yeah, and also I'm thinking of all the Old Testament kind of, the use of the Old Testament in the original too. Yeah.
Well, I mean, it's like the big book of Amish names here too.
True. Yeah.
Right? Like, I mean, Malachi, of course, is the one that, because you're going Malachi.
Yeah.
Right? That's the thing everybody always remembers from the first one. But yeah, it does seem to have this, I don't know, old world feel, at least to the bookended ones, I guess. My experience with the middle ones, I've seen some of them, and I was remembering them better when you were talking about them. I was like, oh yeah. Video store rental, I remember.
Yeah, they all went to DVD.
Yeah.
Straight to
I
video.
feel like we should have had this like in a drive-in or something, this talk.
Oh, really? Because of all the clips.
Well, no, because they are drive-in kind of movies. They're not even B movies, some of them, right? You'd go to Walmart today and they'd be in a big bin for $3 or something.
I will say that one of the things that surprised me is probably my favorite is Isaac's Return. I don't know why.
The
It's
666.
It is. Yeah. And I don't know if I was so pleased by the fact that he had partly written it, But I feel like that it just struck me as quite different and interesting. I mean,
He's
a lot
clearly
of
been dwelling on it.
go ahead.
We talked about this last year, actually, after you went off the air. We talked about John Franklin because I'd pointed out that he was actually in his 20s.
Right.
He's in another horror movie that's even worse.
Really? What's
Tammy
that?
and the T-Rex.
What is it?
Tammy and the T-Rex.
Oh, I don't know that one. And it's
You need to
where?
look up Tammy and the T-Rex. I'm blanking on the guy's name, but one actor and actually became pretty famous. He was in the Fast and the Furious series, and he died in a car accident, rather
Oh,
ironically.
Paul Walker.
Yeah. Yes, he's in it. He's the romantic lead, and basically they steal his brain and put it inside of a robotic dinosaur.
Wow.
And John Franklin is like the graduate lab assistant.
Nice.
Yeah. Given a kabuki level performance.
You know, I was trying to think as I watched them because I found them pretty painful. I was trying to think like what would be the comfort or the appeal of watching all of these. And there is that kind of it's sort of like people who watch Forensic Files like me over and over again, or Law and Order after you've seen it a million times. There's something almost comforting about the pattern that you know is coming.
The predictability.
Yeah, the predictability, the silly deaths. You know, a lot of times I feel like they're kind of making fun of themselves, you know. So
have you watched all of the Phantasm movies?
I have not.
It's the same feeling. Like you've got to like commit to it. It's a journey of like self-discovery, but in the worst campy ways. Like logic, I mean, Children of the Corn, like in terms of logic, will seem like, you know, Milton or Dante. I mean, very thought out and very like plotted to you if you watch all the way from the first Phantasm through Ravager. Like Phantasm, the idea is this guy is stealing bodies and taking them through a secret portal to Mars to enslave the souls of the dead.
Oh
like
my
that's
goodness.
the really quick version of Phantasm, and it's what is this? But it has a similar aesthetic. So Isaac is like a miniaturized version of the ancient tall man preacher figure we see in horror. The other most obvious, Poltergeist 2, right? He's so clearly that. Mm-hmm. Except for he's young. And then of course you've got, I mean, in the original, right, you have this guy who's sort of almost Peter Pan, eternally young because of a genetic disorder.
Right.
So I think that's kind of interesting and weird. And
yeah, I mean, I'm trying to think of other things that would have been going on in the culture related to children, you know, that would specifically have made a child preacher kind of.
Well, I mean, Satanic Panic, of course, which we were talking about before we went on the air.
Right. And then also I was thinking of just the Omen itself, you know, kind of bringing up this idea of the Antichrist. And I think that would have been something that would have inspired interest in this as well.
Village of the Damned was in the 90s, wasn't it?
The remake, 95, I think. Yeah.
That's the John Carpenter remake, right?
Yeah.
With Mark Hamill.
Mark Hamill's in that. Wow.
Mark Hamill.
That.
It's a lot of strange discoveries in that film. So I mean, all right, let's start at the beginning here with the King story versus the first film, because there is always a lot of tension between these. I think for King's money, of course, it's The Shining by Kubrick, which is the biggest bastardization ever, which for me, it's going to be Lawnmower Man. You're going to see a short story gone awry.
Yeah, and also some bad CGI, like in the second one.
Lawnmower Man 2 is really
right.
Another one of these sleepover movies from the 90s. But yeah, Children of the Corn, you know, as you pointed out, it's a very short story, especially very short for the number of sequels. You're starting to come up with like a sequel for every 3 pages.
Right.
So it is interesting that, I mean, you don't see this one, particularly the original, discredited.
What do you mean discredited? The short story?
Well, I mean, he is so vitriolic about The Shining.
Mm-hmm. You know, there's some interesting history there. some of the research I did said that King wrote the first screenplay for Children of the Corn, and then that the director didn't like it because he said they had an argument where King said, "You don't understand horror," and I think the guy said, "You don't understand film." And King had focused a lot of the beginning of the film on the couple fighting, and so we didn't get to the action quickly enough. And what I've heard is that at like the last minute, I think King demanded more money for the use of his name, which came out of the film budget, which is partly the excuse that some people will give for the bad effects and some of the strange moments at the end. So I don't know with that kind of background, if he's not discrediting it because he doesn't want that whole side of things to come up. Do you know what I mean? That might be more self-serving.
Because he wrote the first draft of the Shining screenplay too, and Kubrick there's pictures of Kubrick with a typewriter just retyping the script.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Some novelists are not meant to be screenplay writers, that's for sure.
Yeah, I mean, he wrote the Storm of the Century screenplay of his work.
Yeah. I don't know if I've seen that. Is it good?
It's not bad. It's an interesting idea. And again, you might like it. It involves children. But, with this one, I mean, it is interesting because, like, you do have the deterioration of the adult heteronormative couple as a general starting place in King.
Mm-hmm.
That's pretty universalized, I think we can say. It happens. We already see The Shining. The entire town and it is kind of a reflection of that.
Right. Yeah. I mean, parents are not good parents in King typically.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah.
And so, I mean, if I think to, sorry, Siri responded to me. If I think about that, and I think about sort of like parents in King, and I think of them being as bad parents, which they by and large are, which actually Kubrick does capture if you analyze the film. It would make the violence at the start of Children of the Corn, particularly the movie in the diner, make so much more sense.
Mm-hmm.
But they're not bad parents in the movie. And
No.
it ends with good parents.
Right. Yeah. It's the kids have been corrupted by an outside force, right? And turned against the parents. I don't know. I mean, there's a lot of films that have that kind of I'm thinking of what you were talking about with Satanic Panic. I mean, that's kind of what this is capturing, right? That kids get attracted to some sort of demonic figure or demonic art form, and are turn against the parents because of that.
I mean, it's a couple things here. You got like almost like an extreme version of Lord of the Flies.
Uh-huh. Except the kids aren't fighting each other, really, right?
No, but I mean, they kill the one kid who tries to leave.
Yeah,
right.
It's true.
Games are another thing that's forbidden. So I was thinking about like D&D and its relationship to the Satanic Panic as well.
Yeah.
We just had Joseph Laycock on, and I was reading his book, Dangerous Games. Because they play Monopoly, right? They dress up like adults and play Monopoly.
So are you thinking that of this era's kind of interest in all of those influences on kids being captured?
I think so.
Well, I think definitely in the film version, right? And that's why I think it's so important to have the counterexamples of Job and Sarah,
Sure.
Who weren't exposed to, they weren't in the cornfield of the day that he showed himself.
He made himself known.
Yeah, exactly. That's interesting. The weird irony is, though, that the kids forbid the things that are supposed to cause the problems, right? So there's it's almost like a counter narrative to Satanic Panic narratives, in that it suggests, well, if you don't have any of that fun, then are you going to go just as bad,
Right. Well, I mean, I hadn't heard the Lovecraft quote from King, but I think it's actually the opposite. I'm going to disagree here. Because you don't see stuff in Lovecraft, but we do actually see it in this. But when you transmute in Lovecraft, you see it. You always see it. Like when you become the weird fish thing, we see it. We get long, profound descriptions.
Mhm.
And that's not the case here. And that's also like this glorious transformation, right? At the end of Shadow over Innsmouth, when the narrator becomes like part of the cult of Dagon. We see that. We see the whole build up to that. We already had his full description of what they all looked like. And then he's like, goes through like looking in the mirror each morning and then realizing he'd acquired the Innsmouth look, as he put it.
Uh-huh.
And so, I mean, I don't know that it's Lovecraftian per se in that way.
Well, I think what King was saying was more the space of that. And I'm wondering if he's seeing connections between New England, and the Nebraska landscape in terms of, the ideas of small town, maybe a kind of innocence that he's.
Yeah, I want to touch on that, living in Nebraska and
Yeah, I know.
experiencing Nebraska. I got some thoughts here. The sign in the first one, which I hadn't paid much attention to, and I need to pay more attention to signs. I've been obsessing over the Blair Witch sign at the beginning. Gatlin, nicest little town in Nebraska. There's a lot to unpack in that. Okay. So it is the nicest of the little towns, right?
Mm-hmm.
It is nice by little town standards. It implies that bigger towns are perhaps nicer. And then it only locates itself in Nebraska. So linguistically here, we have a lot.
Yeah. So tell me what you're seeing.
Well, okay. I mean, so this is a fake town, right? Gatlin doesn't exist. We do know for a fact that it is 92 miles away from Grand Island because we see this sign. And Grand Island is the geographic center of the United States.
Oh, yeah. Interesting.
So you can't get more like heart of the country,
mm-hmm.
right? There is a phenomenon in Nebraska that I discovered in the last 15 months of living here called Nebraska Nice.
Ah, interesting. What does that mean?
It's supposed to be like this, pro forma niceness of, community and things. And the way I describe it to people is actually, if you just watch people drive here, you'll see what it means because people run through red lights and things quite commonly. And so it's rather mythological.
Huh.
Yeah. And so like the idea then, because we were talking about this the other night, and it's this idea of what time period is this meant to reflect? And is it, again, just this corruption of the American dream literalized in the exact geographic center of America?
Well, I think it depends on what we're looking at, right? Because I feel like the original story was so much about Vietnam, and I think even the idea that kids are sent into the cornfield, right, at 19 is such an image of Vietnam there. And what
it's a book with a ledger keeping track of when you, right?
Yeah. And with all the birth dates and all of that. I mean, there's just so much. And I think the 2009 remake really picks up on that, in that when Bert, is kind of being followed and stalked by the kids, he goes full on back into that mode. And there's moments where, from what I recall, I haven't seen it as recently, but from what I recall, it's almost like he's taking out all of his trauma on the children, right? And it's a reenactment of Vietnam. So I think the movie, in updating it a decade, ran into a lot of issues. And
he's a yuppie.
What's that?
He's a yuppie now.
Right. And so I feel like also the way that it is depicting something like at the end, they're very much talking about needing to move to Seattle, right? And needing to move to the big city. And I feel like it fits into this, critique that you can see going on, I don't know, mid 20th century in America, where it's like exposing the dark underbelly of the small town, right?
Right.
But also using the nuclear family as an antidote to some of that, I think. Yeah.
No, I think that's correct. I think that we have this sort of like fetishized ideal, and for whatever reason, we decide to geographically place that in our cultural consciousness.
Yeah. I'm wondering though now if that would be the case. Like, where is that the heartland? Is it still
I
in the
don't know.
Midwest? Or yeah, I know. I wonder if it's been moved somewhere geographically. And it probably there's two now,
Maybe.
you know, because the politically, I think we're so divided, right?
Sure. I mean, it's obviously not coastal, right?
Yeah, yeah. But I mean, the fact that they were driving to Seattle has always interested me too.
That is odd.
hmm
And it's never explained why Seattle.
Yeah, I mean, it's
I mean, he
where
has his job, but like, why is it in Seattle?
right, right is the Pacific Northwest become
Also, why would you come through Nebraska to get to Seattle? Like, why wouldn't you go?
make the movie
About-
happen?
Yeah. Because you needed corn. Oh man, when I moved here, it astonished me. I went to the grocery chain here called Hy-Vee, and they have a popcorn aisle.
A whole
It is an
aisle.
aisle of nothing but popcorn, and I did not know that was a thing that could exist.
Wow.
And so I
They're
asked
that-
students about it, and they're like, "Yeah, of course." I'm like, "What do you mean, of course? How many different types of popcorn do you?"
Are there? Can you tell the difference between the different types?
I cannot, but I guess there are popcorn connoisseurs out there. I'm not a huge popcorn fan outside of like if I go to a
I'm not
movie
either.
theater for some reason I want it, but now
Mhm.
you can just like stream everything. So
Well, I wonder too if there's not some sort of economic commentary going on here, kind of talking about the reliance on corn too as like a as your
yeah, because
primary.
it's cornahol, right? They don't say ethanol, they say cornahol is the gas product they make.
Right,
Ironically, they burn the cornfield down with.
right. And I also think you know, corn is, I grew up in Europe, so corn seems to me to be so distinctly American. You know, corn, when I was growing up in Germany, at least there were lots of cornfields, but they grew corn for livestock, not for people. So I think of like eating corn is so distinctly American, you know, that I think that that's also why the image is there, that Gatlin is really a symbol of America, right?
I love some of the weird remakes and some of the things are clearly ripping off. You mentioned Final Destination. I had in my note, I'm going to read it directly to you. Mika looks like he is the Wish version of Christian Slater in
Oh.
Heathers.
Totally. He totally does. That's a good call. Yeah. I was also thinking when I was watching Urban Harvest, I was like, why are they moving to the city? But then I kept thinking about what goes on in the 90s. You've got, you know, is it when Friends starts around then, right?
Oh, it's got to be Candyman,
Seinfeld
right?
Well, I think in the horror realm, but I just think about how sitcoms moved from, you know, the focus on the family and kind of
Yeah.
suburbia to
Frasier moves to Seattle from Boston.
It's all about Frasier. It's got to be about
It
Frasier.
is. Everything
But I was
goes
thinking
back
about
to Frasier.
the sitcom being focused in the city on single people like Seinfeld, Friends, Sex in the City, you know. So that the film that seems to often glom onto whatever's trendy in media at large and bring it into the film as well.
Yeah, but it is Chicago, right?
Chicago, yeah.
So, because I was thinking about this the other day, I was like, who are the horror icons from the 90s, you know?
That's
Not ones
question.
that, I mean, Ghostface, right? Comes
Mhm.
out of the 90s, but
well, there were those movies. I mean, I feel like it was a lot of the group of teens, right? Like I Saw What You Did Last Summer, or where's the other ones? Urban Legend, right? Isn't that one?
Yep.
But it was kind of weak, wasn't it?
I'm going to call this out. Nobody's ever called this out to my knowledge. I Saw What You Did Last Summer is a ripoff of one of the shorts from Creepshow 2.
Is it?
Yeah, when the woman hits the guy who's hitchhiking.
Oh, that's based on a Stephen King short story, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that whole thing is a ripoff of that, in my opinion.
Interesting.
Mercury stunts the growth, by the way. That's probably why they were poisoning him with mercury. There was a common thing of children performers.
Really?
Yeah. I know that because I've seen the musical Gypsy.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So Gypsy Rosalie, I believe, was fed mercury by her mother too.
Oh, so that's a
to-
common, well, not common, but a thing.
Well, but for this performative action of children staying young and stunting their growth.
Interesting.
They'd also make them chain smoke and things like Judy Garland, right?
Really? See,
Yeah.
I had no sense of that. That's great. Yeah.
So
All right.
I
Thanks.
had an answer for you.
Good. Yay.
Oh yeah, car breaking down too, right? That's right out of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre.
Mm-hmm.
For other
And
plot
also
devices.
what's that?
For other plot devices.
Well, I'm also thinking that was common in the 90s too, right? With, was it Wrong Turn, Jeepers Creepers, all sorts of road trip stories, which may have been riffing on Texas, but is the road trip? I'm also thinking of The Hitcher, you know.
Well, Psycho's a road trip too.
Sorry?
Psycho's a road trip as well.
That's true. That's true. And
Or
I
at
think
least
of
the
the road
MacGuffin is.
trip. The road trip is such a distinctly American thing as well, to me, it seems. Yeah. And then it reproduces, right, the movement west. A lot of times that's where they're traveling,
Through the heartland.
right?
Which, I mean, in terms of the Midwest too, Chicago is also considered the Midwest, which is interesting because I don't think of it that way for whatever reason. I guess because it's urban.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say, because it's urban, maybe. Yeah. Yeah.
So it is interesting. And I don't necessarily know where it starts and stops. Like, where is the end? Is it Utah? Like, where does the Midwest end? Yeah.
I always think of it stopping at Colorado, and then Colorado becomes the West, but I'm not sure why I think that, if that's accurate.
Yeah, because I mean, it's also not, it's just the mid, right? Nebraska's the middle. It's not west nor east. It's the middle.
Yeah, I know. So that term must have its origins from a certain historical period, right? Yeah.
Oh, presumably.
Yeah.
Presumably. Maybe Louisiana Purchase, right? Free California.
Could be. Yeah. I mean, it's got to be before the West Coast gets all set up, right? When it is
So pre 1849-ish.
I would think. Yeah, definitely.
Definitely pre-Panama Canal.
I'm gonna look up Midwest and see
what
used.
Well, it is interesting because I mean, Children of the Corn is the Nebraska horror movie. Like, we're at the time of the year, right? We're 10 days out from Halloween. You get all these lists, and you get sort of like the maps of the U.S., and you get like, this is the favorite candy in each of the states. And is it candy corn for Nebraska? I don't know. But you get like the famous horror movie from each one. And it's funny because I forget which one they give to Virginia, and I'm always quick to point out that Georgetown is in Virginia. So it should be The Exorcist and not the one they give it.
Yeah, when I was looking up what else has been focused in Nebraska, it wasn't a ton. I think I saw The Gallows. There's other corn related movies, like Husk, I think was one of them. But yeah, really, I mean, this is the Nebraska horror franchise. Yeah.
And the reason I actually bring it up is tied to this idea of the Midwest and the American dream and this idyllic version, particularly of white America. When I was talking to Bernadette Calafell the other night, I realized that, because I asked her what the greatest horror to American society was, and she said this sort of anti-blackness fear was what she said it is. And then I pointed out that in America, the major pantheon of horror villains are white guys. Sometimes super white guys. Michael Myers, right? It's titanium white. And they terrorize middle America, suburbia, American dream, Levittown kind of places. With the only time you see it shift is, Candyman, and then you have a black man. And so it is fascinating to me that the actual terrors that you have predominantly in cinema, right? You have the new Halloween movie out right now. It is a white male attacking the cultural sort of like Midwest vibe place. Not necessarily Gatlin, but like a suburb of Omaha.
Right. Yeah. Well, I think too what was interesting, and I didn't go into it, but I did notice there, especially in the 90s films in this franchise, there's really strategic placing of Black characters. There's Black characters in each of the first films, typically allied with the protagonist in some sort of way. And I was trying to think what the films are doing with that. The one that
it's just tokenism, right?
yeah. But I'm
I mean,
not.
the death scene I remember the most, and it's later because it's Freddy versus Jason. So I think 2003 probably. The moment I remember with that is the kill of the black girl in that scene, because Freddy Krueger's statement to her is "How sweet dark meat," and I remember that from the moment I saw it in the movie theater.
Yeah, and I'm also thinking of, was it Scream 2 that had the killing? I mean, that really brought awareness to the idea that the people of color are killed first in films and things like that. Yeah. Here though, I mean, I'm thinking of the fourth one with Naomi Watts. It's actually a Black man is blamed for the murder of his wife and then is redeemed, by the end of the film. So a lot of times they're not, I don't know, I'd have to think more about it, but it's not necessarily that they are the first victims either. So I guess, tokenism is, a perfectly legitimate answer. I'm just wondering if there was some other reason for planting.
In the 90s, I would say no.
No.
From my perspective of looking into like race in the 90s and horror particularly, like Candyman is like this odd entity unto itself. Mm-hmm. And even more so if you actually think of the 92 film, right? If you think about the gay white British man who wrote it.
Well, what about
the white director?
The People Under the Stairs too is an interesting reversal of things too. Where kind of urban youth become the victims of like the white middle class kind of suburban homeowner, right? Yeah, I will say that definitely in terms of the children, that they are predominantly white. I wondered, when you were talking about white male protagonists, I wonder if it differs when you think about children as kind of the protagonists or the villains.
It is interesting too, because the ultimate taboo for the longest time, as you know, has been like violence toward children. And even in the first installment of Children of the Corn, they get punched in the face and everything else by the adults. Right. You pointed out the door being slammed in the face. Presumably it had to be Linda Hamilton to do that because it was a young girl and it wouldn't have passed the censors if the doctor had done it.
Right. Yeah. Or it just would have had a different feeling to it, right?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So, it is interesting on gender lines as well as age lines in terms of like what is the acceptable violence. Because I'm also like, one of the films I'm always fascinated by is Let the Right One In, the original, not the remake, and just the weird sense of sexuality around the female vampire, particularly with her protector. And his obsession with her. That's one-sided, and clearly he has no power in that relationship. Mm-hmm. And then her as an immortal being becoming obsessed with this young boy.
And then she is actually a castrated boy, right? Didn't we talk
about
that? Yeah. So, it's complicated in all sorts of ways, but when you were talking, I was trying to think about like sexuality in Children of the Corn.
It's weird because the marriages in Children of the Corn, they have marriage ceremonies and they're compelled.
Right. And there is, the 2009 remake does add a scene that actually has a couple having sex in front of like the whole congregation, kind of orchestrated by Isaac, who's up at the pulpit during the whole thing. But that's, I'd have to think more about it, but it is kind of weirdly, like it's typically about violence that isn't sexual violence too, which is kind of unusual for horror, which seems to often,
especially with like corn is phallic.
Yes, and it's often in these movies getting inserted into all sorts of orifices.
As
death. Yeah.
So I don't know. I mean, I'd have to think more, much like you, but I don't know. I feel like there's a lot going on. I feel like it's more of a pastiche of a lot of different horror themes, and the longer it goes on, the more pastiche it becomes.
Yeah. I mean, the other themes that, I've seen is the focus. I mean, maybe it's obvious that I'm just overthinking it, but the focus on fire for some reason, like it always seems like things have to be taken down by fire. And I was trying to think, is that, just kind of a religious imagery of some kind, or yeah, I don't know, because I was wondering what
Well,
to
that's the world will be ended in fire the second time, right?
right, yeah.
So
But
perhaps
even
it's that.
fires that create the evil children as well, like some of them are caught in fires, or there's the one where they have to commit suicide by fire. Like, who would want to do that? So it's very strange. So
It's also interesting to me too, in terms of like Christianity, particularly in the original one. Like, it is a strange deviation of Christianity because they make crucifixes and things. You shared the guy Isaac being crucified, but they also have like ones they take to their home that are like two pieces of dried corn created into a crucifix and things. And so it is interesting too, just like this. I don't know. Again, I think back to like Grapes of Wrath, and I think about like the huckster preacher character and like the tent revival. That's really what I think of when I watch this film, more or less.
Yeah, it's
Because he also is dressed that way.
Sorry.
He's dressed that way.
Absolutely. Yeah. But I mean,
or the Neil Diamond song, maybe.
What?
Brother Love's Traveling Salvation Show, right?
Oh, right. Right. Yeah, I mean, that image, I think, is, I mean, I was also thinking of God, Night of the Hunter.
Yes.
And that figure.
Love and hate. No. Now you're on to something, because he hunts the children, right?
Yeah, and it's also set very much in that kind of small town. I can't think where it's located, but it seems very Midwestern-y.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I mean, because it's a fairy tale. It's like a Midwest fairy tale, particularly with all that beautiful scene on the lake. But yeah, no, he deploys religion in that false way, and then uses it to like kill people.
Right. And then Flannery O'Connor's short stories often have these kinds of figures as well. So yeah, it's an interesting fear, that's based in, I don't know. I mean, obviously the Midwest does have strong religious roots.
Sure.
And so how does this, I don't know, play into that? It's not, I don't think these films are at all a demonization of religion.
No. And I mean, I guess that's, if it was set in like Alabama or something, it would have a different feel entirely, right?
Yeah. Why do you think? I mean, you're in Nebraska right now, so I'm curious
about. Well, I lived in Alabama too. Because I mean, living in Nebraska right now and driving around Lincoln on a daily basis and things, I could not tell you what the dominant religion is in Nebraska. I'm not really sure around Christianity or anything. But what I speculate on here, like, in the deep South, it's obviously Southern Baptist. I think we've both talked to Grady Hendricks in the last year. When I read like the Southern Book Club's Guide to Vampire Slaying, those women are clearly Baptist women. Right. And so I think it would take on that shade of specificity, because people would just know, because we would regionally associate that, much like you would regionally associate the New England area, if not Catholic, coming out of a Protestantism that is sort of like more conservative than Church of England Episcopalian. And that's easily defined. Like Utah, Mormonism, it would be super clear, but I think it's a little bit more murky in that situation. And that sort of like lets it escape in some ways the idea of being a religious critique, perhaps.
Yeah, and I know too that there's like in the first movie, I think Bert walks in and says something about how it can't be Christian because, you know, Christianity doesn't treat people with violence and all of that too. So there's like a sense that it's, I don't know, to me, it strikes me just again as very Old Testament, you know, a religion that's kind of linked to the deepest origins of America, really, right? And one that
Sure.
is pretty shameful in ways. You know, you just got me thinking about fire, and I was thinking about even though, you know, when we think of Salem, we know that, you know, people were hanged and not burned at the stake, but the fire is so associated with witchcraft too. I'm wondering if that's why there's so much fire in these films.
Yeah, but then as you said, they're born out of fire too. So
yeah.
I'm not, but you have so many different filmmakers in the pot. When you reach to 12 films,
I know. It's a weird franchise. It seems like directors cut their teeth on in ways, you know, and actors too.
Well, I was explaining Halloween to somebody the other day too, right? I'm like, yeah, so it's 1, 11, 12, 13, or 1, 2, 4, 5, 6, or you know, 3 is by itself. You know, like there doesn't necessarily have to be cohesion in a franchise.
Yeah. And I think too, with those franchises, they are so often focused on a central villain that, you know, that's kind of the linchpin of the whole franchise. And here it just, there's like an idea of what's going to happen in the Children of the Corn story. And then you can just swap in the latest broad-brimmed hat kid, you know.
I guess the other thought I'd have on this in terms of a major film is There Will Be Blood.
In what way?
The kid, right? I forget his name. Paul Dano's character.
Yes.
I mean, he's an Isaac.
Yeah, definitely.
And he meets a similar kind of horrific ending.
But there's nothing, right? I mean, I can't think of anything in American history where you actually have a child like that responsible for something really terrible, right?
No, but you do have like the exploited child preacher.
True.
So I don't know that you need to be responsible for anything to turn it into a horror story.
Right. Yeah.
But I mean, again, I think that's just people associate it with that heartland idea. So
do you feel like you said before that if, you know, things were set in Alabama versus Nebraska, what do you think about in terms of Texas too? I'm thinking of you mentioned breaking down, right?
Yeah.
And the idea of, you know, where do you break down, depending on where you break down, what are you going to face, right?
Yeah.
And so
well, we've seen it. I mean, the new Purge movie kind of answers that, right? The Forever Purge.
What? I don't know, which one is that?
That's the latest one.
Yeah, what happens in it?
Oh, the people in Texas decide they're still going to purge.
Oh, gotcha. Okay.
Yeah, so I think you get like a Yosemite Sam kind of version of this in that regard. You get more like Hostile in America than you get, because you're going to lose some of that folksiness, right? You're going to lose, like, the Music Man is in the Midwest, right? You're going to lose some of that weird, oh, these things don't happen here. We sing songs and play trombones kind of idea. That's going to be lost because there is cultural expectation. And so I don't think you can make like I don't know the main crop of Texas. So
is it more, I feel like though the South is more, again, tinged with sexual violence in a way that the Midwest isn't. Like what I find interesting about the Children of the Corn films is sometimes it's like it's accidental, you know, like if you didn't happen to go into the town, you never would have found it. Yeah. They're not seeking out people. They really just want to remain insular, and they're against kind of invasion from people too.
Yeah, they have like that old guy at the gas station keeping watch for them too.
Yeah, like a traditional harbinger, right? Like that kind of figure.
Like there's a death curse.
Right. But that's
called corn.
It's another thing that's really distinctive, right? Because I feel like in the movies about, say, like redneck horror in other parts of the country, it's almost like they can't wait for someone to break down, you know, like they're fun. Whereas I think the Children of the Corn is very much like We
Well, it
don't.
made me think too, like about living in Germany and stuff. It's like corn itself gets tied to the Thanksgiving narrative pretty hard,
That's true.
and that's this weird Americana thing that we're coming up on that was invented by Abraham Lincoln.
Right. And I guess the farm, I think of, well, I don't know, I was thinking in Texas, it's associated with the meat industry too, which gives it a
Yeah, like cattle and oil, right?
right.
I
Right.
just think of a line from Full Metal Jacket.
Well, have there been also like major crop blights in Nebraska that would have been
Oh, I'm
formed?
sure.
Yeah, that's what I'm wondering too. What was going on economically with that?
You know what though? I think the gasohol thing again though, because you do have the oil crisis in the late Carter administration.
Right.
And when does ethanol start being put into gasoline?
Yeah, I don't know.
And I bet there's a lot of distrust because even here, living here, actually every gas station you go to in Lincoln, you have a non-ethanol option, ironically.
Really? Why?
I have no idea. But yeah, it's almost like, it's like the pure gasoline. It's very strange.
Right.
But I bet there's some latency there too, which is ironic and relate. Because I mean, if you think about that, if you think about corn for food versus corn for fuel, which would be toxic and poisonous.
Yeah. I mean, there's a big difference there. And so it's also changing, right? Instead of like feeding the nation.
Yeah.
It doesn't have
and bringing them places, right? They're using it for travel. So
oh yeah, that's true.
That's going to be my thesis on
That's
this.
your new
It's not what I thought too much about Children of the Corn for whatever reason.
Well, it is so much associated with travel, kind of.
Yeah, I like the original actually well enough, even with the goofy effects. I don't mind a goofy effects movie. I mean, I sometimes enjoy the goofy effects movies, but yeah, it's just it was interesting to hear them all narrativized and to see some of the connections and disconnects, because it's not one I really think about too frequently.
Yeah, no, me. If you hadn't invited me to do this, I don't think I would have watched those.
Like cursing me, like, come on, Matt. I could have done so many other horrible children things. Why Children of the Corn?
Well, what's really interesting about it too is usually when I study evil children, it's often a singular child, and so this is one of those few movies where it's like a group of them, right? Yeah, which is
what was the religious cult in that time period too, of the kids, and they all sang and did performances and things. It was called Children of something.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh
man, I'm totally blanking on that because I watch all these like cult documentaries. I gotta look that one up because I bet that's also happening at this time.
Yeah, I mean, I'm trying to think of. I mean, if King's writing this, what, in the late 70s is what I'm trying to think of. What is going on?
I'm looking this up right now.
You're looking up the cult?
Yeah.
Oh, thank you, Google.
I know, right? Yeah, it's just called Children of God.
There was a lot of, I'm thinking, I don't know how to call it, almost like muscular Christianity. And Grady Hendrix's My Best Friend's Exorcism.
Oh, yeah.
He describes this kind of like weightlifting group that went around, and they would like do cool weight stuff, and then also like, talk about religion. And so there's quite a lot going on in the early 80s around religion.
Yeah, and these, these cults.
Yeah, well, definitely that.
So, I mean, because you also have Family International too.
What's that?
That's another one of these groups. I think it started in the late 60s, early 70s. Started in California.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, got revealed they like have like pedophilic rings and stuff in it.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
I don't know about that historical context. Mm-mm.
Well, because we lose it all. We lose it all in the Satanic Panic, because all of a sudden it becomes like adult teachers preying on children.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so that's where the narrative ends. But I want to thank you so much for tackling Children of the Corn, for burning it down with the fires of Cornahall.
That's right. And I did get some glorious images to live
You
on.
did. I
forever.
hope it's of use to you beyond this, but if not, I'm deeply appreciative as
Well,
always.
I think just alone that Barbie doll special effect was like one of my favorite things that I've seen. So yeah, so that will stay with me.
Win-win.
Yeah, exactly.
I want to invite everybody to take the survey that Juan is dropping into the various chats right now. I invite you all to tune in tomorrow night for Christina Santos's talk. And as always, stay spooky.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Yeah, there's so many. Just all these things. I think you got Heaven's Gate later too, right? The People's Temple. That's the other one I was thinking of. The People's Temple.
Yeah, I'm also, I mean, when was the case where it was like it was like the group of boys who killed the girl? I'm linking it to Black Sabbath. I don't know. I feel like there was a murder too with like 4 boys. I feel like there was one that was related to around Satanic Panic, but related to them killing a girl and then related to them killing a little boy or something like that. So that might be connected in this too. I don't know.
I mean, it certainly seems to be a driver.
Hmm. The other thing I was really interested in, I didn't talk about at all, was like the how blood gets involved in the narrative. Like in the 4th one, she's able to test the blood to see if they're infected. So there was weird, but it was just too much to go into. But they
drink blood in the 1st one too, right?
They do, yeah, because he comes in as a doctor. He's like, that's. I think he says something about it, not being sanitary or something.
Right.
Yeah.
The vampires of the corn.
Yeah, right. Yeah. I don't know. What a weird series, but it was fun.
It is. It's just. I mean, and it's interesting. I mean, because it fits in with a lot of too what we've been talking about around Satanism and witchcraft. As well.
We're off, by the way, right? We're off.
Well, this is that weird moment where people can hear us talking, but there's music playing and the credits are rolling over.
Oh.
So it's a wonderful sort of